The girl sold like a cattle, and the man the town feared chose to save her. She was sold in broad daylight, not in the dark, not secretly, right on the streets of Red Hollow, in front of dozens of people. And no one spoke. No one dared. 23-year-old Alara Quinn was shoved onto a horse-drawn cart like a commodity, her hands bound, unable to cry for help because her buyer was the most powerful man in the region. But fate sometimes takes unexpected turns, and that day, a stranger rode into town. Click like, follow, and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't miss a part. This story will keep you hooked. The morning they took Alara Quinn, the sky was the color of old rust. She had woken before dawn the way she always did. Before Martha's voice could find her, before the creak of the floorboards gave away her position in the house. She'd learned early that the best defense against her stepmother was invisibility. Move quietly, finish the work before being asked, eat whatever was left rather than what was prepared. In the 3 years since her father had died, Alara had perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible. She was at the well behind the house, cranking the handle with both hands when she heard the wagon. It wasn't unusual for wagons to come through Red Hollow before sunup. The town existed at the intersection of two trade routes, one that ran north toward the mining camps in the Black Ridge Hills, and another that cut east toward Copper Falls, where the railroad had finally arrived 2 years ago. Wagons passed through at all hours. Alara had stopped noticing them. But this one stopped in front of the house. She let the bucket drop and wiped her hands on her apron, listening. Men's voices. Low, deliberate. The kind of voices that didn't carry news or trade goods. The kind that meant business of a specific and uncomfortable sort. Martha met them at the door before Alara could make sense of what she was hearing. "She'll be out in a moment," her stepmother said. No preamble, no greeting. Alara came around the corner of the house and stopped. There were two of them, large men in long dark coats despite the summer heat, hats pulled down, faces that had seen too much sun and done too little to deserve the lines they wore. Behind them, hitched to the wagon's rear post, were two more horses. The wagon itself was a flatbed with iron rings bolted to the sideboards, the kind used for transporting equipment or containing something that needed to be contained. "That her?" one of the men said to Martha. Martha looked at Alara with an expression that might have passed for regret if regret required any actual feeling. "That's her." Alara said, "What is this?" Martha tucked something into the front of her dress. Paper. Folded. Alara couldn't see the denomination, but she heard the dry whisper of it, and her stomach dropped 6 inches. "You've been a burden long enough," Martha said. "Your father's debts are your debts. Mr. Callum has agreed to settle them in exchange for your labor." "My labor?" "At his operations in Blackridge." The larger of the two men stepped forward. He had rope already in his hands, coiled loosely, the way a man carries something he expects to use. "I'm not going anywhere," Alara said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she hadn't been a moment before, high and fast, like something trying to escape a cage. "You don't have a say in it," Martha told her. "The arrangement's been made." "What arrangement? I'm not property." "The debt agreement." "There is no debt agreement." Alara felt something cold move through her then, something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite rage, but lived in the territory between them. "My father didn't owe Silas Callum anything. He told me. He told me specifically." "Your father told you a lot of things." Martha smoothed the front of her dress where she'd tucked the money away. The gesture was almost casual. "He was a man full of things to say. Wasn't much good at the rest of it." The man with the rope reached her before she could back away. He was faster than he looked, which she should have anticipated from the way he'd been standing, weight forward, knees slightly bent, like a man ready to move. His hand closed around her wrist, and the rope followed in a motion that had clearly been practiced many times. Alara did not go quietly. She kicked him hard in the shin, which accomplished approximately nothing except making him grunt and tighten his grip. She twisted toward the second man as he came in from the side, and she managed to claw a line down his cheek before his arm locked around her from behind, pinning both her elbows to her sides. "Spirited," said the first man, inspecting the mark her boot had left on his shin without much emotion. Callum mentioned that. Let me go. She said it quietly now because screaming had already occurred to her and been discarded. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile east, and in Red Hollow, screaming from the direction of the Crow property was not a novelty. People had learned not to investigate. She'd heard her own voice echo off empty streets too many times to trust it now. Let me go and I won't. I'll find another way. I'll work here. I'll earn whatever Martha says I owe. You're past that, the second man said. He wasn't unkind about it, which was almost worse. He said it the way a man delivers weather news. They walked her to the wagon. Martha stood on the porch and watched and did not look away, but also did not speak again, which was perhaps the most honest thing she'd ever communicated. There was nothing else to say. The transaction was complete. Alara's wrists were tied to one of the iron rings on the sideboard. The rope was rough hemp, coarse enough to have already left marks before the knot was fully set. She sat on the bare wooden bed of the wagon and looked at the street as they pulled away from the house. Red Hollow was waking up slowly, the way it always did. Smoke beginning to rise from the bakery chimney, a dog nosing at something near the trough outside the livery, two men sitting on the steps of the hardware store with their hats still pushed back from sleep. Old Hector Birch was sweeping his barbershop step, same as he did every morning, and he looked up as the wagon rolled past. His eyes found hers. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. She couldn't have formed words right then, even if she'd known which ones to reach for. Hector Birch looked away first. He looked at his broom. He went back to sweeping. That was Red Hollow. That was the whole truth of it, concentrated into a single moment. A single pair of eyes dropping to the ground because looking meant choosing, and choosing meant risk. And risk was something this town had decided long ago it could not afford. The wagon cleared the edge of town and the buildings fell away and there was only the road north, two muddy ruts cutting through dry grassland toward the dark line of the Black Ridge Hills on the horizon. Silas Callum's operation in Black Ridge was not a secret exactly. It was the kind of thing everyone in a 50-mile radius had heard some version of. The mining claims, the processing facility, the company store where workers ran up debts they could never quite pay down, no matter how many hours they worked. The kind of closed system that ate people slowly and made it look like bad luck. What was less openly discussed was the other side of Callum's business. The arrangements, the agreements, the way certain individuals, people without family money, without legal standing, without anyone positioned to ask hard questions, sometimes found themselves obligated to Callum in ways that went beyond wage labor. Alara knew about it in the way you know about a disease in a neighboring county, as a category of thing that happened, abstract and distant, not something you expect to one day find yourself inside. She had 4 pieces of paper folded into the lining of her left boot. This was not something she'd planned. She hadn't woken up that morning thinking she needed to hide documents on her person. She'd found them 3 weeks ago in her father's trunk, the one Martha had been slowly emptying and selling off piece by piece, and she'd taken them because they were the last things that felt like they belonged to him. And she hadn't known yet what they meant. She'd read them 4 times. She understood now what they meant. They were letters. 2 of them were from a man named Amos Dale, who had been the county land assessor before he died of what was officially recorded as a heart condition at the age of 41. The other 2 were from her father to Amos Dale, drafts that had apparently been never sent. Her father had kept his own copies, which felt like him, careful and cautious, even when caution ultimately hadn't protected him. The letters described a pattern. Callum's acquisition of mineral rights in the Black Ridge Hills over a period of 8 years, the way the assessments had been structured to undervalue surrounding properties, the bribes paid and received, the men pressured out of their claims through manufactured debt. Her father's name appeared in the letters not as a participant, but as a witness, someone who had seen something he wasn't meant to see and had been quietly sidelined for it. The letters were not proof of everything, but they were proof of something. She pressed her left boot against the floor of the wagon and felt the slight crinkle of paper against the arch of her foot. The men in the front of the wagon were talking about a card game. They'd apparently been losing money steadily for the past 2 weeks and had theories about why. Alara listened to them argue about it and watched the road behind the wagon. Red Hollow had vanished, swallowed by a fold in the grassland, and there was nothing in any direction except the great indifferent openness of the territory. She worked at the rope with her right thumb while they argued about cards. The knot was a simple cinch, the kind you use when you're in a hurry and not particularly worried about the person getting loose. She wasn't getting loose, not with one hand fixed and the angle wrong, but working at it gave her something to do and kept her hands from shaking. Her father's name was Thomas Quinn. He had come to Red Hollow 20 years ago with a small amount of savings, a gift for reading land, and an absolute conviction that the territory would open up if a man was patient enough. He'd been right about the land. He'd been wrong about the patience required, or perhaps wrong about what the opening of the territory would look like, who would benefit from it, and what it would cost the people who'd arrived before the money did. He'd died of a fever when Ilara was 19. The fever had come in autumn and been gone in a week, which was fast even by frontier standards, and Ilara had thought about that more than once in the years since. She'd thought about it and then set it aside because she had no way to do anything with it. She set it aside now too. She needed to think about the immediate problem, which was the wagon and the rope and the distance between herself and the Blackridge Hills growing smaller by the hour. They stopped at midday to water the horses at a creek crossing. The men climbed down and stretched and ignored her with the particular efficiency of people who deal with cargo regularly and have stopped registering it as human. One of them tossed a canteen in her direction without making eye contact. It landed near her feet. She drank from it because she was thirsty and because refusing things on principle was a luxury for people who had options. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal. The creek was low for summer. The current barely moving, the banks dried back to cracked mud and exposed root. There'd been less rain this year. Everyone said so. The grassland was browner than it should have been, and the dust on the road was fine and deep and got into everything. Ilara looked at the creek, at the thin band of cottonwoods along its banks, at the road ahead curving north. The hills were visible now, not a dark line on the horizon anymore, but actual shapes, the ridges distinct, the color of iron. The mines were somewhere in there, tunnels punching into the earth, men bent double in the dark for wages that kept them perpetually one bad week from destitution. She thought about what it would mean to arrive there, what Callum would consider he'd purchased, what she would and would not be able to control. She had the letters. That was one thing. She'd had the presence of mind to take them from the house the last time Martha sent her into town, a month ago, because she'd read them by then and understood that if Martha found them, they would disappear. The letters existed. They were in her boot. They were something, but she needed to be somewhere that wasn't the back of this wagon to do anything with them. The larger man finished watering the horses and climbed back onto the seat. The second man checked the hitch and then came around the side and looked at her, the first time either of them had looked directly at her since they'd left Red Hollow. "You gonna give us trouble?" he asked. Not threatening, genuinely asking, the way you might ask a person if they want coffee. "Depends on what you consider trouble," she said. He almost smiled. Figured. He checked her rope, tightened it slightly, not cruelly, just precisely, and climbed up front. The wagon moved. Pike. The rider appeared from the east. Ilara saw him before the men in the front did because she was facing backward and had nothing else to look at. He came out of a draw that cut down from a low ridge. A single horse moving at a pace that wasn't a gallop, but covered ground faster than it looked like it should. The horse was a dark bay with no markings she could see at this distance. The rider sat straight in the saddle, which was the kind of posture that comes from years on horseback, not from trying to sit straight. She didn't know who he was. She'd never seen him before. He was too far away to read the details of his face, just the shape of him, broad-shouldered, a hat with a flat brim, the glint of something at his hip. He wasn't riding toward the wagon particularly. He was riding in the same general direction, parallel and slightly angling. He might have been going to the same creek crossing. He might have been going anywhere. Then one of the men in front said, "Damn," in a low, flat voice, and the wagon slowed. "That's Maddox," the second man said. The first man said nothing, but his posture changed. Ilara looked at the rider again. Closer now, the angle shifting as the wagon slowed. She still couldn't read his face clearly, but she could see the quality of his attention, the way his head had turned just slightly toward the wagon. He'd noticed them. He'd noticed them and hadn't looked away. "Rhett Maddox," the second man said again, quieter, as if saying the name again would help him decide what to do about it. Alara had heard the name. Everyone in the territory had heard the name, though the stories varied enough in their details that the truth of him had been difficult to separate from the legend accumulating around him. What she'd heard sifted down to what people agreed on. He had come from somewhere in the Eastern Territories. He had a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. He had never worked for Callum's operation, despite at least 2 approaches that she knew of, and the men who'd made those approaches were no longer in Red Hollow or anywhere nearby. The wagon stopped completely. The rider had slowed too, angling toward them now without hurry, and Alara could see his face when he was perhaps 30 yards away. Angular, sun-darkened, a few days of stubble, eyes that were doing the careful, unhurried cataloging of everything they landed on. He looked at the men in front, then he looked at her, at her wrists, at the rope on the iron ring. He didn't say anything immediately. The larger man said, "Maddox, we're on Callum's business. No concern of yours." Rhett Maddox looked at him for a moment. "That what you'd call it?" It wasn't a question. His voice was even, not loud, the kind that doesn't need volume to carry. "The girl's property of..." "She's not property." "The contract..." "There's no contract that makes a person property." He said it the same way he'd said everything else, which was to say without any particular heat. He might have been discussing the weather. He might have been discussing anything. But the larger man had stopped talking, which said something about how the words had landed. Alara looked at this stranger on a dark bay horse and felt something complicated move through her, something she was careful not to call hope too quickly, because hope was an expensive thing to maintain, and she'd already spent a good deal of it on nothing. "Who are you to say so?" the second man asked. "Someone who has a problem with it." Rhett Maddox shifted slightly in the saddle. The movement revealed the handle of the pistol at his hip more clearly than before, though his hand hadn't moved toward it. "Cut her loose. You're one man. I'm aware. Callum has 20... I know what Callum has." He looked at the second man with an expression that was difficult to read. Not threat, not bravado, just a kind of exhausted certainty. "Cut her loose." The second man looked at the first man. The first man was looking at Rhett Maddox with the particular attention of someone calculating odds and not liking the answer they keep arriving at. "This isn't finished," the larger man said. "No," Rhett Maddox agreed. "It isn't." The second man climbed into the wagon bed and cut Alara's rope. She didn't move immediately. She sat and rubbed her wrists. The marks the hemp had left were red and would be worse tomorrow, and looked at the man on the horse and tried to determine what had just happened and what came next. "Can you ride?" he asked her. "Yes." He nodded toward the second horse, the one tied to the back of the wagon. "Take that one." The larger man said, "That horse belongs to..." "Consider it a fee," Rhett Maddox said, "for my inconvenience." They rode for 2 hours before he said anything beyond the immediate logistics of direction and pace. The horse was a good one. A roan gelding with a smooth gait and more speed in reserve than she'd expected. Alara had grown up on horseback, her father insisting on it, and she settled into the saddle with the ease of someone returning to a familiar language after years of speaking nothing else. Rhett Maddox rode slightly ahead and slightly to her left, which she suspected was habit, a position from which he could see both the terrain ahead and what was behind them without turning his head fully. He checked their back trail every 10 minutes with the regularity of a clock. "Where are you taking me?" she finally asked. He glanced at her. "Where do you want to go?" "Red Hollow." He absorbed this. "That's where they took you from." "Yes." "You want to go back?" "I have to go back." He looked at her again, this time for long enough that she felt the weight of the attention. "Why?" She hesitated. 3 weeks ago, she wouldn't have told anyone. 3 weeks ago, she'd been cataloging her options carefully, looking for the right moment, the right person, the right combination of circumstances. She hadn't found any of those things. She'd found herself in the back of a wagon instead. "I have documents," she said. "Correspondence. Evidence of what Callum's operation actually is. Not just the mining claims, but the trafficking, the debt manipulation, the arrangement he's running with the sheriff and the county assessor's office." Rhett Maddox said nothing. The letters date back 8 years. They document specific transactions, specific people, specific amounts. 2 of them were written by Amos Dale before he died. At Dale's name, something shifted in his expression. Small, controlled, but there. She'd been watching closely enough to catch it. "You knew him," she said. "Of Dale." A pause. "He was my father's lawyer, before." She waited. "Before Callum took my father's claim," he said. "About 7 years ago. Dale drew up the original deed. When Callum moved on the claim, Dale tried to—" He stopped, started again. "Dale tried to file a contest. He was dead 3 months later." The grassland moved past them, dry and gold in the afternoon light. "I've been looking for something that connects Dale to Callum directly," Rhett said, and there was a quality to his voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite vulnerability, but something adjacent, something that had been carried a long time and had weight. Something in writing, something that could be used. The letters named Callum, specifically and by amount. He was quiet for a long time after that. "You've been carrying these letters how long?" 3 weeks. "Knowing what they were?" "Yes." "And you stayed in Red Hollow?" "I had nowhere to go and no way to move on them alone." She met his look steadily. "I was waiting for the right circumstance." Rhett Maddox looked at her for another moment and then looked back at the road. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something more businesslike, the way a person's voice shifts when they stop assessing a situation and start making decisions about it. "Red Hollow," he said. "All right." They made camp that night in a dry wash a mile off the main road. Rhett built a fire small enough to give heat without much light, and they ate from the provisions he'd packed without a great deal of ceremony. He handed her hardtack and dried beef and a canteen that tasted considerably better than the one she'd been given on the wagon, and didn't comment on the speed at which she ate, which she appreciated. "Tell me about the sheriff," he said. "Hale Drummond. Been sheriff for 11 years. Callum put him in the position originally. Helped with the campaign, such as it was." She thought through what she knew. He's not an unintelligent man. He understands what he's protecting and why. He also understands that Callum could remove him just as easily, which makes him careful to be useful. "Who else?" "Harlan Webb at the land office. Theo Crane. He runs the bank in town and handles Callum's legitimate business interests as cover. There are others, smaller players, men who've done specific favors at specific times." She looked at the fire. The letters name Webb and Crane specifically. Drummond less directly, but the pattern is there. "What about townspeople? People not on Callum's payroll?" She thought about Hector Birch at his barbershop step, eyes dropping to his broom. "They're frightened, which is different from being complicit." "Is it?" "Sometimes." She pulled her knees up. "People do terrible things out of fear and call it survival. That doesn't make them evil exactly, but it doesn't make them innocent either. Red Hollow has been watching what Callum does for a long time. They've made a calculation about the cost of speaking up versus the cost of staying silent. And if the calculation changed, if it became clear that staying silent was going to cost more than speaking up, yes. People are not particularly principled in either direction. They're practical." He was looking at her with that careful cataloging attention again. "How long have you been thinking about this?" "About Callum, specifically?" "Seriously, 3 weeks. About the way power works in a place like Red Hollow?" She considered. "Since I was about 16 and understood what my father had walked into." The fire cracked. An owl called from somewhere in the dark beyond the wash. "Your father," Rhett said. "The letters. He knew about all of this. He saw things he wasn't supposed to see. I think he kept the correspondence because he thought it might protect him. That if Callum knew he had it, Callum would leave him alone." She paused. "I think he miscalculated how patient Callum could be." Rhett didn't say anything to that, but he nodded slowly, the nod of someone who has reached the same conclusion through a different set of evidence. "The fever," she said. "My father's death. I've never been able to—" "Don't go down that road tonight," he said. Not harshly. "Tonight you need sleep. Tomorrow we need a plan." She almost pushed back. She'd been down that road in her own mind too many times to count, and having someone else tell her where to put her thoughts felt presumptuous. But she was tired in a way that went past physical, and he wasn't wrong about the need for sleep, and so she let it rest. "Thank you," she said, "for stopping the wagon." He looked at the fire. "Don't thank me yet. I'm thanking you for the specific thing you did, not the outcome of what comes next." He glanced up at her and something moved in his face. Not quite surprise, but the look of a man who expected something different and is recalibrating. "Fair enough." She lay down with her back to the fire and her left boot still on and fell asleep faster than she'd thought possible, which was either a sign of exhaustion or of something she didn't have a precise word for. The feeling of having moved, finally, from stillness into motion, however uncertain the direction. Bam. They reached the outskirts of Red Hollow the following afternoon. Rhett pulled up on the ridge above town, and they sat there for a long time without speaking, looking down at the spread of it. The main street with its dozen storefronts, the church at the north end, the livery and the mill, and the cluster of houses fanning out from the center like something that had grown without quite intending to. Small and sun-bleached and ordinary, the way frontier towns always looked from a distance. The kind of place that kept its ugliness inside the buildings rather than showing it on the street. "Callum will know you're gone by now," she said. "The men will have reported it." "Yes." "Drummond will be looking for you." "Probably." "You don't seem concerned." He looked at the town. "I've been thinking about coming back to Red Hollow for a while. The circumstances aren't what I'd have chosen, but the destination is the same." "What do you need?" "To talk to a few people. People who aren't on Callum's side but haven't been willing to say so out loud." He turned to look at her. "The letters alone aren't enough. Letters can be contested, dismissed, claimed as forgeries. We need people who'll stand up and confirm what the letters describe." "That's the hard part. It's always the hard part." He looked back at the town. "You said the townspeople are practical, so we need to change the math." She understood what he meant. It wasn't about righteousness or justice or any of the principles people invoked when they'd already decided to act. It was about making the safer choice align with the right one, making it more dangerous to stay quiet than to speak. "Callum is coming," she said, "whether we go into town or stay up here. We've already started something." "We have." He settled his hat. "So we might as well go down." She looked at Red Hollow one more time from above, the place that had looked away from her, the place that had watched her get dragged out and done nothing. She felt the letters in her boot, the slight crinkle of paper against her foot, and she thought about her father's handwriting in those unsent drafts, the careful loops of someone who chose his words precisely. She thought about Hector Birch and his broom. She thought about all the people in all the windows of all the buildings below who would, when this came to a head, have to decide something they'd been avoiding deciding for years. She put her heels to the roan and rode down the ridge toward Red Hollow. Red Hollow looked exactly the same as it had 2 days ago, which was the first thing that struck Alara as she rode down the main street beside Rhett Maddox. She didn't know what she'd expected, some visible sign that the town understood what it had done, or what had been done within its sight. But the street was the same packed dirt, the same storefronts with their faded paint, the same smell of horse and sawdust and someone's noon cooking drifting from an open window. The hardware store, the land office, the bank with its narrow windows and its air of self-importance that Theo Crane maintained through sheer force of performed dignity. Hector Birch's barbershop. He was inside today, visible through the glass, a smear of a figure moving behind the reflection of the sky. Alara looked at the window as they passed and kept riding. The reaction to Rhett was immediate and specific. She'd expected something. His reputation had that quality, arriving before him like weather, but the reality of it was more pronounced than she'd anticipated. A man coming out of the dry goods store stopped with his hand on the door and didn't move again. 2 boys chasing something across the street pulled up short and went very still. The woman sweeping the porch of the boarding house stopped mid-stroke and watched them pass with an expression that was difficult to read. Not hostility, not welcome. Something in between that might have been calculation. Rhett didn't acknowledge any of it. He rode the way he did everything, with an economy of attention that made it impossible to tell what he was registering and what he was letting go. But he was registering everything. She was beginning to understand that about him. They tied their horses at the post outside the hotel, the only establishment in Red Hollow with a second floor, which made it the closest thing the town had to neutral ground. And Alara felt the attention of the street as a physical pressure, a collective held breath. "People are staring," she said. "People always stare. At you or at me?" He glanced at her. "Both, I expect. You're supposed to be in Blackridge by now." She hadn't thought about how her return would read to the town. She'd been thinking about Callum and Drummond and the letters and the mechanics of what came next. She hadn't thought about walking back down the street she'd been dragged out of and what that would look like to the people who'd watched her go. It felt, she decided, like a statement, whether she'd intended it as one or not. Sheriff Hale Drummond found them within the hour. They were in the hotel dining room, Alara eating with the focused determination of someone running on less food than she needed, Rhett with his back to the wall and his coffee in front of him. When the door opened and Drummond came in with two of his deputies arranged behind him like punctuation. Drummond was a tall man who'd gone to fat slowly and evenly, the way some men did, so that he still carried himself with the posture of someone physically capable, while the evidence of years of comfortable corruption had settled around his middle. He had a lawman's face, deliberately neutral, arranged for authority. And he wore his badge the way men wear things they've stopped seeing. He pulled out the chair across from Rhett without being invited and sat down. "Maddox," he said. "Drummond." Drummond looked at Alara with an expression that was supposed to communicate official concern and communicated instead a calculation about risk. "Miss Quinn, there's been a report that you were taken from your home under duress." "I was," she said, "and now you're back." He picked up the salt shaker on the table and turned it in his hands, which was a habit she'd seen him exercise before, something to do with his hands while his mind worked. "Funny thing about that." "Not especially funny," she said. "I was purchased by Silas Callum. Two of his men tied me to his wagon and transported me north on the Blackridge Road. The transaction was arranged by Martha Crowe." Drummond set the salt shaker down. "Those are serious allegations." "They're statements of fact. I was there." "Martha Crowe tells it differently." "Martha Crowe was paid." Laura kept her voice even. She'd thought about this conversation on the ride down from the ridge, had run it through her head in multiple versions. "Whatever she told you, she told it for money, which she tucked into the front of her dress while two men tied a rope around my wrists." Drummond's eyes moved to Rhett. "And you were involved in this how?" "I came across a woman tied to a wagon on the Blackridge Road," Rhett said. "I untied her. Callum's property." "She's not property." Same words as before, same even delivery. Drummond looked at him for a long moment. The deputies behind him shifted slightly, the way men shift when they're waiting for a signal that isn't coming. "Callum has a legal claim, a debt arrangement, properly documented." "I'd like to see that documentation," Alara said. Drummond paused. "The documentation of the debt. The original agreement. My father's signature." She held his gaze. "If it exists, I'd like to see it. That's a reasonable request. These things take time to—" "How much time does it take to produce a document you claim exists?" Drummond looked at her with something new in his expression. Not quite anger, but the thing that lives next to anger in men who are used to not being pressed. "Miss Quinn, I'd advise you to be careful about the tone you're taking with—" "I'm asking to see a legal document. The tone seems appropriate to the request." Rhett said nothing. He drank his coffee. Drummond stood up. The chair scraped. He looked at Rhett for another moment, doing that calculation again. The same calculation every man in town apparently ran when they looked at Rhett Maddox, the same uncomfortable math. "Callum will be in Red Hollow by tomorrow," he said. "Whatever you think you're doing here, you might want to think about it again." "Thank you for the information," Alara said. Drummond left. His deputies followed, the door swinging behind them with a little more force than necessary. Alara put her fork down and realized her hands had been steady throughout the entire conversation, which surprised her. "He didn't arrest us," she said. "Not yet." Rhett refilled his coffee from the pot on the table. He's not sure what we have. He needs to talk to Callum first. That gives us tonight. It gives us part of tonight. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Who do you trust in this town? Even a little. She thought about it honestly. Doc Emery. He's not brave, but he's decent, which is sometimes more useful. She turned her fork over. And Nora Watts. She runs the boarding house. You saw her on the porch. Her husband worked one of Callum's claims for 3 years and came out of it with a debt that took her another 4 years to pay after he died. She knows what Callum is. Will she say so out loud? I don't know, but she might, under the right circumstances. Nora Watts did not look pleased to see them. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely and the kind of face that has become careful over time. Not unfriendly, but guarded, every expression passing through an internal review before it reached the surface. She let them into the boarding house sitting room without a word and stood with her arms crossed while Alara laid out the situation. She listened without interrupting. When Alara finished, she looked at Rhett. You're the one who stopped the wagon, she said. Yes. And you're planning to do what exactly? Take on Callum's whole operation. Expose it, Alara said. Publicly, with documentation. Documentation, Nora said the word as if testing its weight. You know what Callum does to people who bring documentation against him. Amos Dale, Rhett said quietly. Something moved across Nora's face. Not surprise, she knew the name clearly, but the particular expression of a person who has kept a thought private for a long time and finds it unexpectedly voiced. Dale tried the proper channels, went to the county office, filed papers, followed every procedure the law said to follow. She uncrossed her arms and crossed them again. Proper channels didn't do him much good. We're not using the proper channels, Alara said. Or not only them. If we file with the county office, it goes quiet. We need a witness who'll stand up in front of the town. In front of every person Callum needs to be afraid of losing. And you think I'm that witness? Your husband's debt ledger with Callum's company store, do you still have it? Nora went very still. I'm asking because if you do, Alara said, it might corroborate what the letters describe. The pattern of how the debts were structured, how men were kept unable to pay them down. It's one more piece. I burned those ledgers, Nora said. Alara nodded. She'd thought it might be something like that. The relief of destroying the evidence of a humiliation, even if the humiliation itself couldn't be burned. But I remember every line of them, Nora said. Her voice had changed, had gone somewhere lower and harder. I spent 4 years paying what was written in those books. I remember every line. Rhett looked at her steadily. He didn't push. He'd been doing this, creating space for people to arrive at their own decisions rather than filling the space with arguments. And Alara had started to understand it as a deliberate approach, not passivity. What happens if this doesn't work? Nora asked. Then Callum continues what he's doing, Alara said, and the next woman on a wagon to Blackridge doesn't have someone come across her on the road. It was perhaps too direct, but Nora Watts had been living with a practical calculation for years, and practical calculations responded to concrete stakes more readily than to appeals to principle. Nora looked at the window. The afternoon light was going golden and long, the shadows on the street outside stretching toward evening. Callum arrives tomorrow, she said. It wasn't a question. That's what Drummond told us. Then you have tonight. She turned back from the window. Doc Emery is usually at the Rusty Nail after supper. Tell him I sent you. Doc Emery was not at the Rusty Nail. He was behind the Rusty Nail, in the narrow alley that ran between the saloon and the Saddler's, sitting on a barrel and looking at the sky with the expression of a man who has recently made peace with several things he didn't particularly want to make peace with. He was a thin man of 60-something, with hands that had been steadier in earlier decades and eyes that were still sharp despite everything he'd done to the rest of himself. He'd been the only doctor in Red Hollow for 20 years, and he carried that in the way of a man who has seen too much consequence with too little ability to prevent it. He looked at Alara when she came around the corner, and he didn't look surprised, exactly, but something in him rearranged. You came back, he said. I came back. He looked at Rhett behind her and nodded slowly, the nod of a man confirming a theory. Maddox. Heard you were in town. He looked back at Alara. Martha told people you went willingly, said you'd made arrangements. Martha was paid to say that. He was quiet. The alley smelled of sawdust and something sharper. Whiskey, she thought, or the memory of it. I know, he said finally. I was watching from my office window when they put you on that wagon. The words sat there. You saw, Alara said. I saw. He looked at his hands. I told myself there was nothing I could do, that they were Callum's men and Drummond would... He stopped, started again. I've told myself that more than once over the years, about different things. Rhett said, How many of Callum's men have you treated? Emery looked up at him. What do you mean? Injuries, gunshot wounds, men who had accidents in the mines that weren't accidents. Rhett leaned against the alley wall. Over 20 years. In a town where Callum has been running his operation the whole time. I'm asking how many men you've treated whose injuries told a story that nobody officially told. Emery was quiet for a long time. A door opened somewhere above them, someone at a window, then closed again. A number, Emery said. Would you be able to speak to that? Stand up and say what you've seen. That's a significant thing to ask. It is. Callum has reached beyond Red Hollow. If it goes wrong, yes, Rhett said. We need you to understand what we're asking. But the question is what you can live with, Doctor, not what's safe. It was the most Rhett had said in one stretch since she'd met him, Alara realized. And he'd said it without force, just laid it down like something he'd been carrying and had decided to set on the table. Emery rubbed his face with both hands. Let me think on it. Till morning, Alara said. That's what we have. She and Rhett left him in the alley with his barrel and his sky and his 20 years of things he'd told himself when he looked away. They were back at the hotel when the rock came through the window. Not the glass, the shutter was closed, but the impact rattled the frame and the note tied to the rock landed on the floor between them with a dry crack. Alara picked it up before Rhett could move. She unfolded it. 3 words in an uneven hand. Leave by dawn. She turned it over. Nothing on the back. She looked at the writing again. Unpracticed, deliberate, disguised perhaps, but suggesting someone unused to disguising their handwriting, someone who usually wrote more fluidly than this cramped anonymous scrawl. Drummond? She asked. Rhett had gone to the window and was standing to the side of it, looking out through the crack of the shutter without exposing himself to the street. Could be anyone. Could be someone Callum sent ahead. He let the shutter settle. Or someone who's genuinely warning us. As opposed to threatening us. It reads both ways. He looked at the note in her hand. The question is the same either way. We don't leave. We don't leave. She put the note on the table and sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was small and functional. A bed, a washstand, a chair, a window that now felt considerably more present than it had an hour ago. The lamp cast a warm circle, and beyond it the shadows were unspecific. Tell me about your father's claim, she said. He looked at her. Then he sat in the chair and told her. He told it plainly, without the kind of embellishment that turns personal history into grievance. Just the facts of it, the timeline, the way Callum had moved on the mineral rights after the initial assay showed silver in the lower seam, the legal maneuvering that had rendered her father's original deed somehow insufficient, the way Amos Dale had tried to fight it and what that had cost him, the way Rhett himself had spent 4 years trying to build a case with nothing solid enough to take anywhere. And then you heard about the letters, she said. I heard you had something. He looked at the floor. Word travels in the territory. People talk. Martha talked. Someone in her circle. When she was arranging the sale to Callum. He looked up. I was already moving in this direction. Your situation. It moved up my timeline. It was not, she thought, a romantic explanation. It was not the story of a man who had seen a woman in distress and ridden to her rescue on some impulse of gallantry. It was a man who had been working towards something and found that 2 trajectories had converged at a specific point on a specific road. She found this, unexpectedly, more reassuring than gallantry would have been. The letters name Callum in connection with Dale's original contest filing, she said. There's a letter from Dale to my father in which he describes a meeting. A specific meeting, a specific offer Callum made to get Dale to drop the contest. The language is careful, but the meaning is clear. That's coercion, potentially. It's coercion. If someone who understands the law looks at it and says so in public. She pressed her foot against the floor, the familiar crinkle of paper. We need someone with legal standing to present it, not just us. Rhett was quiet, working through something. There's a circuit judge, he said slowly. Passes through Copper Falls on the second Tuesday of every month. Judge Ira Hollis. He's not in Callum's pocket. I know this because Callum tried to get him there and it didn't take. Copper Falls is 8 hours east. 7. Hard ride. He looked at her. But if we can get a message to Hollis before Callum arrives tomorrow, we'd need someone to ride tonight. They looked at each other. Nora Watts has a nephew, Ilar said. Young man, maybe 18, fast rider. She mentioned him once in passing. That's a lot to ask of an 18-year-old. Everything about this is a lot to ask of someone. She stood up and went to the washstand and poured water into the basin and rinsed her face with it, the cold shock of it cutting through the fatigue that had been pressing in since they'd left the ridge. We ask, people decide. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, the rope marks still visible on her wrists, fading to yellow around the edges. Her hair needed attention. It wasn't going to get tonight. She looked like what she was, a woman who'd spent 2 days on the move with inadequate sleep and insufficient food, making calculations about forces significantly larger than herself. She looked, she thought, like someone who had decided something. Outside, Red Hollow had gone quiet the way it went quiet every night. Not the quiet of safety, but the quiet of a place that has learned to keep its sounds inside. Somewhere down the street, a horse moved in its stall. The hotel sign creaked. Tomorrow, Silas Callum would arrive, and the town would have to choose. Tonight, she had letters in her boot, and one man she trusted, and a few people who might, under the right pressure, find something in themselves they'd been storing unused for years. It wasn't much. It was what there was. Nora Watts' nephew was named Cal, and he was not 18. He was 16, which he announced with the particular pride of someone who considers the distinction significant. He was lean and dark-haired and had the restless energy of a young man who has been waiting for something to happen in a town where nothing ever does. He listened to what they needed without interrupting. Then he said, Judge Hollis, Copper Falls. Tonight. Before dawn, if you can manage it, Rhett said. I can manage it. He looked at his aunt. Nora gave him a look that communicated several things simultaneously. Worry, permission, and the specific maternal instruction to not get himself killed, compressed into a single expression that only people who've known each other a long time can produce. Cal nodded at her. Then he looked back at Rhett. What do I tell him? Alara handed him a folded note she'd written at the hotel desk an hour earlier. Everything is in there. His name is on the outside. You put it in his hands directly. Not a deputy, not a clerk. His hands. And if he's not at the hotel, try the courthouse, try the saloon, try wherever a circuit judge goes when he's in Copper Falls. She met the boy's eyes. It matters. Understand that. Yes, ma'am. He said it without irony, which was either respect or the focused calm of someone who'd already made his decision and was past the need for ceremony. He was on his horse and gone inside of 4 minutes, the sound of hooves fading east into the dark. Nora stood at the doorway of the boarding house and watched the direction he'd gone for a long moment after the sound disappeared. He rides well, she said, to no one in particular. He does, Rhett agreed. He'd better. They went back inside. Besemt. Sleep was not something Alara managed cleanly that night. She lay on the hotel bed and drifted in and out of something that felt more like suspended consciousness than rest, aware of every sound from the street, every creak of the building settling, the distant punctuation of a dog that barked twice and went quiet. At some point past midnight, she gave up on it entirely and sat at the window in the chair Rhett had occupied earlier and looked at the street. Red Hollow at 2 a.m. was as honest as it ever got. No performance, no deliberate arrangement of how things looked. Just the empty street and the buildings and the moonlight that made everything flat and clear and slightly unreal. She could see the land office from here, Harlan Webb's domain, his name on the sign in careful letters. A man who had facilitated 8 years of calculated fraud from behind a desk that probably smelled of linseed oil and ambition. She took the letters out of her boot. She'd read them enough times that the words came back to her without needing to read them again. The specific phrasing of Amos Dale's second letter, the part that laid out the meeting with Callum most clearly. He told me directly that the contest would become inconvenient for everyone involved, and that he was prepared to make my inconvenience go away if I was prepared to make his go away first. Careful language. A careful man writing carefully, documenting something he knew was dangerous to document. And then he died 3 months later of a heart condition at 41. She folded the letters and held them in her hands and thought about her father, who had kept these, who had understood what they were and kept them anyway, tucked in a trunk under his winter coat, waiting for a moment that apparently never came while he was alive to use them. She thought about what Rhett had said in the alley behind the rusty nail. The question is what you can live with. He'd said it to Emery, but it applied to everyone in this town, and it applied to the dead too, in a way. Her father had lived with this, had kept these letters and kept his silence and kept his careful distance. And then the fever had come in autumn, and he'd died with the papers still in the trunk. She didn't know if she was angry at him. She'd been trying to decide that for 3 years and hadn't gotten there yet. She put the letters back in her boot. Outside, nothing moved. The street stayed empty. She watched it until the sky at the far eastern edge began to shift from black to something slightly less absolute, and then she heard them. They came from the North Road. Not a wagon this time. Horses. Several of them, moving at a pace that was controlled and deliberate, the pace of men who know where they're going and aren't in a hurry because they don't need to be. She was at the window already, and she counted them as they came into the main street, 7 riders, with Silas Callum in the middle. She had seen Callum twice before in her life. Once at a town meeting 3 years ago, where he'd sat in the front row and said very little while the meeting arranged itself around his presence. Once on the street outside the bank, getting in and out of a carriage. Both times she'd registered him as a man of a specific type. Not large, not visibly threatening, the kind of power that doesn't need to display itself because everyone in the room already knows it's there. He was perhaps 55, gray-haired, with the build of someone who had once been lean and had since become compact in the way of men who eat well and work little. He wore his clothes with the ease of money. Not showy, just good, the kind of quality you notice because it's not trying to be noticed. He rode past the hotel without looking up. He didn't need to look. He already knew she was here. Alara went and knocked on the door of the room at the end of the hall. Rhett answered immediately, which told her he hadn't slept either. He was already dressed, hat on, gun at his hip. He looked at her face and read it without needing an explanation. "How many?" he asked. 7, including Callum. He was quiet for a moment. Not afraid. She'd stopped expecting that particular expression from him, but thinking. That changes the calculation. It changes the numbers, not what we're doing. He looked at her. You're sure? We sent a 16-year-old boy into the dark to ride to Copper Falls. I'm not going to be less sure than a 16-year-old. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that might, in other circumstances, have become a smile. All right. He picked up his hat from the bed where he'd apparently set it when he heard her knock. All right, let's go talk to some people. Doc Emery was at his office before the sun was fully up, which Alara took as its own kind of answer. He'd been there since early, from the look of it. The lamp had been burning a while, papers on his desk rearranged in the way of someone who has been going through things and thinking about what they mean. He looked up when they came in, and his face had the particular quality of a man who has made a decision overnight and is now committed to it in the exhausted, clear-eyed way of someone who's done arguing with himself. I have records, he said without preamble. Medical records, 7 years of them. I've been going through them since you left. He gestured at the papers on his desk. 3 men who died of injuries that were documented as accidents. The injuries are inconsistent with the official accounts of how they occurred. 2 more who left town suddenly after coming to me with injuries I'd classify as with injuries that indicated they'd been beaten deliberately. Alara stood in the doorway and looked at the papers. You kept records of all this. I keep records of everything. That's what doctors do. He said it with a kind of defiance, as if daring someone to tell him this was insufficient. I kept them, and I told myself they were just documentation, medical documentation, in case anyone ever asked. He picked up the top sheet and looked at it. Nobody ever asked. I'm asking, Alara said. He set the sheet down. I know. Will you stand up in public with these? The question sat in the room for a long moment. Emery looked at the papers, then at Rhett, then at Alara. The lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. Callum arrived this morning, Rhett said. 7 men. I know, I saw them from the window. Emery rubbed his jaw. He's going to go to Drummond. Drummond is going to try to arrest you both on some charge or another. Yes. And if your plan falls apart, it might fall apart, Alara said. I won't tell you it won't. But the alternative is you put those records back in the file, and Callum keeps doing what he does, and the next thing that needs a doctor in this town does so for the same reasons the last 7 things did. Emery looked at her for a long time. He had the eyes of a man who has looked at a great deal of suffering and not always been able to do anything about it. And that kind of looking leaves a specific residue, a wariness, but also a hunger for the times when doing something is actually possible. The public space, he said. You're talking about the street, in front of everyone. In front of everyone, she confirmed. We need witnesses that Callum can't make disappear quietly afterward. We need the whole town there. How do you propose to get the whole town there? Rhett said, we start something visible, Boak. What they started, specifically, was a confrontation on the steps of the sheriff's office at 9 in the morning. Alara walked up to the door of the sheriff's office with Rhett beside her, and she knocked on it loud enough to be heard from the street. When Drummond opened it, already aware, clearly, already with the adjusted posture of a man who has received instructions, she said, loud enough for the 2 men visible outside the land office to hear, I am here to report a crime, Sheriff. Specifically, the unlawful sale of a person against her will, facilitated by Martha Crow and arranged by Silas Callum, who arrived in Red Hollow this morning with 7 armed men. Drummond said, Miss Quinn, I'd advise you to lower your voice. I'm filing a report, she said, at the same volume. Is there a reason I should file it quietly? The 2 men outside the land office were no longer going into the land office. They were standing on the step, watching. A woman crossing the street had slowed. One of Drummond's deputies was visible in the doorway behind the sheriff, watching with a young man's uncertainty. He couldn't have been more than 22, and he had the look of someone who had taken a job as a deputy because it came with a steady wage and hadn't yet fully understood what it would ask of him. Come inside and we'll discuss it properly, Drummond said. I prefer to discuss it here. I'm not asking. Then we can stand in the door like this for a while, Alara said. People seem to be paying attention, which is convenient. Drummond's jaw tightened. He looked past her at Rhett, doing that calculation again, and Rhett looked back with the same steady unhelpfulness he brought to most things, giving the sheriff nothing to work with in either direction. You have no standing to. I have letters, Alara said. Written by Amos Dale and my father, Thomas Quinn, documenting Silas Callum's activities in this county over the past 8 years. Mineral rights fraud, debt manipulation at the company store, coercion of county officials. She paused. And the trafficking of persons, which I experienced directly. A small crowd had collected now, a dozen people at least, stopped on the street or come out of storefronts, standing at a careful distance that communicated both interest and the frontier habit of not positioning yourself too close to trouble until you know which way it's going. Drummond stepped forward and dropped his voice. You want to be very careful, girl. Don't call me that, she said, quietly but clear. He blinked. The word had apparently landed differently than he intended. You have Callum's men in town, she continued. You have your 2 deputies. That's 9 men with guns who benefit from the current arrangement. I understand that. But you also have a street full of people who are going to remember what happens here today, and whatever story you tell afterward is going to have to account for all of them. Drummond looked at the street. He looked at the faces looking back at him. He could read them the same way she could. The calculation, the watching, the slow reorientation of people who have been thinking of themselves as bystanders and are beginning to understand that the moment for that particular self-description is expiring. He made a decision, the wrong one. "You're under arrest," he said to Alara, "disturbing the peace." She'd anticipated this. She'd told Rhett it would probably come to this, and she had one move left before the situation became purely physical, which was a contest she couldn't win on those terms. She reached into her boot. Drummond's hand went to his gun. "Letters," she said. "Just letters." She held them up. The four-folded pages, slightly worn at the creases from weeks in her boot, the most important things she owned. She held them up so the street could see them. "These are documents. You're arresting me for having documents." Someone in the crowd said something. She couldn't hear the words exactly, but the tone was recognizable. The particular tone of a person who has been quiet a long time and has just stopped being quiet about one specific thing. Drummond reached for her arm. Rhett stepped between them. He didn't touch Drummond. He just moved, one step, positioning himself between Alara and the sheriff's hand, and the physical fact of him in that space was enough. Drummond stopped. Behind him, the young deputy had come fully out of the doorway and was standing on the steps with his hand on his gun, but not drawing it, watching this with the expression of a man waiting to understand what was actually happening before he committed to a side. "You're obstructing," Drummond began. "She's holding papers," Rhett said. "What are you arresting her for?" "I told you." "Disturbing the peace." Rhett looked at the street. "That what this looks like to you people? Someone disturbing the peace?" It was a deliberate invitation, and Alara understood it as the tactic it was, drawing the crowd in, making them participants rather than audience. She felt the shift happen. She couldn't have described it precisely, but she felt it, the way the weight of the street changed. And then Silas Callum walked out of the hotel. He came out unhurried, alone, buttoning the last button of his jacket with the particular composure of a man who has decided that the appropriate response to chaos is to demonstrate that it doesn't touch him. His men were visible at the edge of the scene, spread out, she noted, positioned without being obviously positioned, covering angles the way men cover angles when they've rehearsed it. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Drummond. He looked at Rhett. Then he looked at Alara, and she had the experience of being looked at by a man who considers the question of what to do with her already settled. "Miss Quinn," he said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There hasn't," she said. "The arrangement with your stepmother was the purchase of a person. You can call it an arrangement if you'd like. The letters describe it differently." She held them up again. "Amos Dale's letters. My father's letters, documenting what you've been doing in this county for 8 years. Callum's expression did not change, which was itself a kind of change, the micro-adjustment of a man controlling his face against an impulse. "Letters can say anything. Letters can be fabricated. These ones have dates and names and specific amounts." She looked at the crowd. "And a doctor who has been keeping medical records for 7 years that tell a story, Amos Dale's letters, and these letters all point to together." Emery had appeared at the edge of the crowd. He was standing with his records folder under his arm, papers he'd clearly brought from the office, and the sight of him standing there with those papers in his hands, that visible commitment of a man who'd spent years not committing, did something to the people around him. She saw it happen. Several people moved slightly, closing the distance between themselves and the center of the street, as if the space between observer and participant had been reduced to a step they were now willing to take. Nora Watts was there too, at the edge. She'd come without Alara asking her to. Callum looked at Emery. He looked at Nora. He looked at the faces on the street with the calculating attention of a man taking inventory, counting what he has against what he's facing, running the numbers. One of his men shifted on the far side of the street. Just a shift in weight, not a draw, but it was enough. Rhett turned, tracking the movement, and the turn was enough that everyone on the street saw it and understood what it meant. The young deputy on the steps of the sheriff's office was still watching. His hand was on his gun, but he hadn't drawn it. He was looking at Callum's man on the far side of the street, and then back at the crowd, and then at Drummond with an expression that was working through something complicated. "Drummond," Callum said. His voice was even and quiet. "Handle this." Drummond looked at the crowd. He'd been looking at the crowd this whole time, Ilara realized. Not at her, not at Rhett, at the crowd. Reading it the way a man reads terrain. And what he was reading was not what it had been an hour ago, or a year ago, or 8 years ago, when he'd first made his arrangement with the man now standing behind him. "Callum," Drummond said. His voice had changed. Callum waited. What did you do to Amos Dale?" The question fell into the street like something dropped from a height. Ilara felt the crowd hold its breath. She felt Rhett go very still beside her. Drummond said it again, not louder but with a different quality. The quality of a man who has just heard himself say something out loud that he's been thinking for years and is now committed to having said it. "What happened to Amos Dale?" Callum looked at him for a long moment. "Hale, I need to know." Drummond's voice was not steady, but it was moving forward, which was what mattered. "I've done things for you, Callum, and I've told myself they were business, but I need to know what happened to Dale." "This is not the place. This is exactly the place." He turned and looked at the crowd. "I've been sheriff here 11 years. There are things I've done that I can't—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Callum, what happened to Dale?" Callum's composure cracked. Not dramatically. A small fracture, a shift in the set of his mouth, the micro-expression of a man who has lost control of a room he's controlled for a very long time. He looked at his men, the spread of them around the street, doing the math. "This isn't finished," he said, to Ilara, to Rhett, to the street. "No," Ilara said, "it isn't." And then Callum's man on the far side of the street, the one who had shifted weight earlier, the one Rhett had turned to track, drew his gun. He didn't fire immediately. He drew it and held it, which was its own kind of statement, an attempt to reset the math through visibility of force. But the street was full of people now, and the gun was out, and the young deputy on the steps looked at the drawn weapon and at the crowd and at Drummond, and then did something that Ilara would think about later, in quieter moments, as the hinge on which everything turned. He stepped down from the steps and put himself between Callum's man and the crowd. He was 22 years old and his hand was shaking visibly, and he stood there anyway. "Put it away," he said to Callum's man. His voice cracked on the last word. He was scared. He was clearly, visibly scared, and he stood there anyway, and the crowd that had been watching became something different in that moment. Became people who had just seen a frightened young man choose a side, and were now reconsidering what choosing a side might cost, and whether that cost was something they could pay. Nora Watts walked forward out of the crowd. She walked to the center of the street, and she stood next to Ilara, and she said, in a voice that carried the whole length of the main street of Red Hollow, "My husband's name was Gordon Watts. He worked Callum's Black Ridge claim for 3 years and came out with a debt he couldn't pay, no matter how many hours he put in. He died owing money he never should have owed to a man who designed the whole system so that you couldn't pay it down." She looked at Callum. "I remember every line of every ledger, and I'll say so in front of whoever's asking." The street was absolutely silent. Callum's man still had his gun out. Rhett was watching him with the complete attention of someone who has narrowed the entire world down to one point. Ilara held the letters in her hand and felt the paper, and thought about her father and about Amos Dale, and about the people standing on this street who had been calculating for years, and were now, in this particular morning light, arriving at a different answer than the one they'd been carrying. The gun stayed out for 4 seconds. Ilara counted them. Not deliberately, but afterwards she would find that she had, the way you sometimes discover your mind has been doing something precise and separate from the chaos occupying the rest of your attention. 4 seconds of Callum's man holding that pistol on a street full of people, of the young deputy standing between it and the crowd with his hand shaking and his feet planted, of Rhett absolutely still beside her with the quality of stillness that is the opposite of passivity. Then Callum said, "Put it away, Briggs." Briggs hesitated, half a second, the hesitation of a man checking that he'd heard correctly, and holstered the gun. The street exhaled. Not the situation. The situation was nowhere near resolved, and everyone standing in the morning light on the main street of Red Hollow understood that. But the specific, immediate danger of a drawn weapon pointing at a crowd had passed, and the passing of it created a moment, a seam in the pressure that shifted the quality of everything that came next. Callum turned to look at Drummond. Whatever he'd been planning to say, Drummond didn't give him the opening. "I want to see the letters," Drummond said. He wasn't looking at Callum when he said it. He was looking at Alara. "The ones from Dale." Alara looked at him carefully. She was trying to read the distance between a man cracking open and a man running a new angle, and she couldn't be fully certain which this was. But Drummond's face had the quality of someone who had made a calculation at considerable personal cost and was now on the other side of it, standing in unfamiliar territory. "You'll see them when Judge Hollis sees them," she said. Drummond blinked. "Hollis?" "He's been sent for. He may already be on his way." She watched that land, watched Callum's reaction to it, the second small fracture of the morning, a tightening around the eyes, a recalibration. Hollis was a name that meant something different than Drummond or Webb or any of the county structures Callum had spent 8 years making useful. Hollis was federal adjacent and unbought, and the introduction of his name into the morning changed the shape of the thing Callum was trying to manage. "You're bluffing," Callum said. "I sent a rider last night," Alara said. "You can believe me or not, but you arrived this morning with 7 men to recover me and the letters, and I'm standing here with the letters, and the only question now is how this ends." Callum looked at the crowd. He was doing what he always did, reading the room, assessing, calculating. She could almost watch him doing it, the practiced scan of a man who has spent decades understanding which way groups of people are leaning and adjusting his approach accordingly. What he found this time was different from what he was used to finding. Red Hollow had never been a town of heroes. It had been a town of practical people making practical decisions under practical pressure, and the practical decision for 11 years had been to accommodate Callum because the cost of not accommodating him was too immediate and too concrete and too personal. But something had shifted in the architecture of that calculation, and Callum was reading it happening in real time, and Alara could see him reading it, and watching him read it was the most frightening thing that had happened all morning because it meant he was about to do something. He looked at Rhett. "Maddox," he said, "I know who you are. I know what you've been trying to do." He said it conversationally, as if they were discussing a business proposition over drinks. "Your father's claim, there are things about that situation you don't have the full picture on." Rhett said nothing. "I could tell you the full picture," Callum said. "There were factors involved that Dale never communicated to your father, documents that would explain the discrepancy in the deed. If you're willing to sit down and discuss this properly—" "No," Rhett said. "You haven't heard. There's nothing you're going to tell me that changes what's standing on this street right now." His voice was the same even register it always was. "You don't have a version of this that I'm interested in hearing." Callum absorbed that. He nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information away. Then he looked back at the crowd, and something in his posture settled into a decision. "Webb," he said. Harlan Webb had been standing at the back of the gathered people. Alara had spotted him 10 minutes ago, slightly behind 2 other men, as if the bodies in front of him constituted cover. He was a narrow man with the look of someone who has spent his professional life being precise about things and has confused precision with virtue. He didn't move when Callum said his name. "Webb," Callum said again. "I heard you," Webb said. He still didn't move. Something in Callum's expression shifted. Not panic. He wasn't a man given to panic, but the recognition of a new variable, the adjustment that comes when a piece you've relied on stops behaving predictably. "I need you to go to the land office," Callum said. "There are documents in the—" "I know what's in the land office," Webb said. His voice was thin and not entirely steady. "I put them there." He looked at the crowd, then at Alara, then back at Callum. "I've been putting things there for 8 years. The crowd was very still. "Harlan," Callum said. One word, and in it was the full compressed weight of 11 years of arrangement. The money paid, the favors exchanged, the implicit threat that ran underneath all of it like groundwater. "I have a wife," Webb said, "and a daughter who's going to be 14 next month." He looked at the street. "She goes to school here. She knows everyone in this town. His voice had found a more solid footing, or was trying to. There are files in the land office, assessment records. I've been keeping them, all of it, everything that passed through that office. Alara heard someone in the crowd make a sound. Not words, just breath. The involuntary sound of a piece of information striking a person directly. Why? Drummond said. Not to Callum. To Webb. Because I'm not stupid, Webb said, with the particular bitterness of a man who has been many things but never, technically, stupid. Because I understood that at some point something like this was going to happen, and when it did, I didn't want to be the only one without something to stand on. It was not a noble explanation. There was no nobility in Harlan Webb's face as he said it. Just the exhausted pragmatism of a man who had spent years making bad decisions for small reasons and had kept his records because he was afraid, not because he was principled, but the records were real, and they were in the land office. Callum turned to his men. It happened faster than Alara had anticipated, which was her failure of imagination. She had pictured this moment as something that built to a clear point, some culminating declaration, some visible surrender, the orderly collapse of Callum's position under the weight of evidence and testimony. She had not properly accounted for the fact that Callum had not arrived in Red Hollow expecting to capitulate. Three things happened nearly simultaneously. Briggs went for his gun again, not the tentative display from before, but a committed draw, aimed at Rhett specifically because Rhett was the variable that changed all the other calculations. The second of Callum's men, a heavy-set figure she'd registered but not focused on, moved toward Webb with a purpose that was not ambiguous. And Callum himself turned and walked, not ran, back toward the hotel with the specific composure of a man who knows that the ground is going and has decided where he needs to be when it does. Rhett drew before Briggs cleared the holster. He didn't fire immediately. He had his gun up and level, and he said "don't" in a voice that was the same register as everything else he said, and Briggs made the calculation that Alara had watched every man make when they looked at Rhett Maddox, and he stopped. The second man reached Webb. Drummond shot him. The sound of it cracked across the street, and everyone who hadn't already moved did so now. She will back away, the instinct of people putting distance between themselves and gunfire. Alara stood still. She found, in the moment, that she was not particularly afraid of the gunshot, which told her something about her own condition that she filed away for later. The man who'd moved toward Webb was on the ground, shot through the shoulder, alive and in considerable pain. Drummond stood with his gun out and an expression that was difficult to read. Not triumph, not righteousness, just the face of a man who has just done something he can't undo and is present enough to know it. He looked at his gun. Then he looked at the crowd. Then he looked at Alara. "The rest of you," he said to Callum's remaining men, loud, carrying, "hands where I can see them, now." There were 5 of them left, Briggs and 4 others who had been positioned around the street and who were now in the position of men whose employer had just walked away from a situation that was deteriorating. They looked at each other. They looked at Drummond and at Rhett, guns up and pointed with the patience of men who are content to wait. They looked at the crowd, which had not dispersed but had rearranged itself. People had come out of storefronts. There were more of them than there had been 20 minutes ago. The street had become something it very rarely was, which was a public space where Red Hollow was genuinely present. Briggs put his hands up first. The others followed. Sir, Callum had not gone far. He was in the hotel. Alara had seen him go in. And the question of what to do about a man in a building was different from the question of what to do about a man on a street. Rhett handed custody of Briggs and the other men to Drummond's young deputy, who was still visibly shaking but managing it the way you manage fear when you've already committed to not letting it run you, and went into the hotel. Alara went with him. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't suggest she stay outside. They'd moved past that kind of discussion somewhere between the ridge and the main street. The hotel lobby was empty. The desk clerk had apparently decided that discretion required relocation, and the stairs were straight ahead. Rhett took them with his gun out and Alara behind him, and at the top of the stairs he paused and listened. Room 3. The door at the end of the hall was closed. Rhett looked at it for a moment. Then he knocked. The sound of it was almost absurd given the circumstances. A courtesy, a formality, in the context of everything that had just happened in the street below. But he knocked anyway and waited. "Callum," he said, "it's over." Silence. "Your men are in custody. Drummond is out there. Webb has already told the street what's in the land office." He paused. "There's a judge coming from Copper Falls." More silence. Then the sound of something, a drawer maybe, or a case being set down. "I've been in worse positions than this," Callum said through the door. His voice was controlled, still controlled, which was remarkable, and also told her something about the depth of the man's investment in the performance of composure. "Maybe," Rhett said, "but not with this many witnesses." A long pause. "The letters from Dale," Callum said. "I'd like to know how you came to have them." "My father kept them," Alara said. "He was a careful man." Another silence, longer this time. She heard Callum move inside the room. Footsteps, not toward the door, but the movement of a man who is thinking in the way that requires physical motion. What Dale documented, Callum said, was one side of a complicated situation. There were parties involved who had their own... "Callum," Rhett said, "I'm not here to argue the case with you through a door." "Then what are you here for?" "To tell you that the door is the choice. Come out of it, or we come through it." He said it without inflection. "The outcome is the same either way. You come out in one condition or another." Silence. Then the door opened. Callum stood in the doorway of the hotel room with his jacket buttoned and his hands empty at his sides. He looked close up, like a man of 60 who has spent those years indoors. The skin of him, the eyes that were sharp but had the quality of sharpness that comes from watching things rather than doing them. He looked at Alara. "Your father was a stubborn man," he said. "He was," she agreed. "It wasn't personal." She looked at him for a moment. "It was entirely personal," she said. "You took his claim. You took his livelihood. You arranged for the only lawyer trying to help him to die of a convenient heart condition at 41. And then you waited. And when he died of his own fever, you bought my stepmother and sent men with rope." She kept her voice level. "All of that was personal. You just didn't consider him a person, so it didn't feel that way to you." Callum had nothing to say to that. She hadn't expected him to. Rhett took him by the arm, and they went back down the stairs. The street outside had continued evolving in the 20 minutes they'd been in the hotel. The two men Callum had positioned on the far side, the ones who hadn't been directly involved in the confrontation but whose function had been visible, were sitting against the wall of the barbershop with their hands bound in front of them, which meant someone had produced rope and used it, and the someone turned out to be Hector Birch, who was standing nearby with his arms crossed and an expression that managed to be both deeply uncomfortable and resolutely present. Alara looked at him. He looked back at her. "I have rope in the back," he said, by way of explanation. "For bundles." "I know," she said. He nodded once, sharply, and looked away. And she let him have that. The privacy of a man sitting with what he's done and what he didn't do, and the distance between those two things. Doc Emery was kneeling next to Callum's man who'd been shot, working without hurry, but with the focused efficiency of someone in his element. He'd produced his bag from somewhere. She hadn't seen him go get it. And he was talking to the man on the ground in the low measured tone of a doctor managing pain and panic simultaneously. The man was conscious and white-faced and clutching Emery's sleeve, and Emery let him hold it without comment. Drummond had his gun holstered and was overseeing the custody of Callum's men, with the air of a man who is not entirely sure of his footing, but is committed to maintaining the appearance of certainty until he finds it. He'd positioned his young deputy, whose name, Alara would learn later, was Fen Colby, at the end of the line of captives, and Colby had stopped shaking and was managing the situation with a visible determination that would have been touching in less urgent circumstances. When they brought Callum out of the hotel, the street went quiet again. Not the held breath quiet of before. A different kind. The quiet of people watching something conclude. Callum walked without being dragged, which she supposed said something, though she wasn't sure what. His composure had not entirely deserted him even now, which was perhaps the most illuminating thing about him. The machinery of control ran so deep it kept functioning even when everything it was meant to control had come apart. He looked at the street as he was walked through it, looked at the faces. "You'll regret this," he said to no one specifically. "Most of you will regret this." No one said anything back. That was, Elara thought, its own kind of answer. Judge Ira Hollis arrived at noon. Cal Watts had found him at the hotel in Copper Falls. Not the courthouse, not the saloon, but the hotel, where Hollis had been eating a late breakfast and reading a 2-week-old newspaper with the contentment of a man who considers this a reasonable use of a Tuesday. Cal had put the letter in his hands the way Elara had instructed, and Hollis had read it and set down his newspaper and called for his horse with the efficiency of a man who has been a circuit judge long enough to recognize when something requires immediate personal attention. He was a large man, older, with white hair, and a face that had the particular weathering of someone who has spent decades listening to people tell him things and has developed the capacity to hear what they're not saying as clearly as what they are. He rode into Red Hollow and took in the scene on the main street. The men along the wall, Drummond standing in the street, the general atmosphere of something recent and unresolved, and dismounted without visible surprise. "Miss Quinn?" he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at her. He looked at the letters she was holding. "Those the Dale correspondence?" "Yes, sir." "And the Land Office records Webb mentioned, are they secured?" "Drummond has 2 men at the Land Office door," Rhett said. Hollis looked at Rhett with the expression of a man who has heard the name and is now applying it to the person. "Maddox." Not a question. "Judge." Hollis looked at the street. At Callum, standing with Drummond's hand on his arm. At the townspeople who had remained, who were more than half of Red Hollow now, gathered in the afternoon sun on the street where the morning had happened. At Hector Birch still standing next to the men he'd bound. At Nora Watts near the front of the crowd. At Emery packing his bag near the wall. "All right," he said. He handed his reins to Cal, who took them with the slightly stunned expression of someone who has just successfully completed something he wasn't entirely sure he could do. "Let's get to work." The proceedings that followed were not fast. Hollis commandeered the hotel dining room and spent the rest of the afternoon taking statements. Elara first, then Emery with his medical records, then Webb, in a conversation that lasted 90 minutes and required 2 separate breaks during which Webb stepped outside and stood with his hands braced on the porch railing breathing air that presumably felt different than the air inside the room where he was accounting for 8 years of what he'd done. Nora Watts's statement was 12 minutes long and required no breaks. She said what she'd said on the street, said it more precisely and with dates she'd apparently been carrying in her memory for years. And when she finished, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at Hollis with the expression of a woman who has discharged an obligation and is prepared for whatever comes next. Drummond's statement took most of the evening. Elara wasn't in the room for it, but she could track its progress by the silences and the occasional sound of Hollis's voice asking a follow-up question. Rhett sat with her in the lobby, both of them running on the specific kind of energy that fills in when sleep and food have run out, and the body makes do with adrenaline and forward momentum. Neither of them talked much. There wasn't much that needed to be said. At some point she became aware that her hands were shaking slightly. Not fear, past fear, something post-fear, the physical acknowledgement of everything that had been held tight all day beginning to release without permission. Rhett noticed. He didn't say anything about it. He moved slightly in his chair so that his arm was closer to hers, not touching, just present, and she found that this was enough. Martha Crow was brought in from the house on the edge of town at 8 in the evening. Drummond had sent Colby, who managed it with the same determined competence he'd been applying to everything since he'd stepped off those stairs that morning. Martha arrived with the money still tucked in the front of her dress and an expression that had cycled through several positions since morning and had arrived somewhere between defiance and calculation, waiting to see which one would serve her better. Elara stood in the doorway of the hotel dining room when they brought her through and looked at the woman who had sold her. Martha looked back. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "Did you know what he would do with me?" Elara said. "Specifically." Martha looked at the floor, then back up. "I needed the money. I know. Alara held her gaze. I know you needed the money. That's the worst part, maybe, that it was about money and you didn't even need very much of it. Martha didn't answer. There was nothing to answer with. Alara stepped back and let them bring her through. It was past 10 when Hollis finished for the night. He came out of the dining room with the methodical tiredness of a man who has done a great deal of precise work in a compressed period and has the professional's relationship with fatigue, acknowledging it without letting it change what comes next. He found Alara and Rhett in the lobby. The letters are sufficient, he said. Combined with Webb's records and Emery's documentation, there's enough to bring charges in federal court. Dale's correspondence establishes a pattern going back far enough that it will support the mineral rights case as well as the trafficking charges. He looked at Alara. Your father's drafts are significant. The fact that he kept them, kept copies of letters he apparently never sent, gives them a specific kind of evidentiary weight. He kept everything, Alara said. He was careful that way. Hollis nodded. Callum will be transported to the county seat tomorrow morning under my authority. I'll be filing an injunction against the Black Ridge operation pending the investigation. The assets associated with the operation will be frozen. He paused. This is going to take time. The court proceedings, the review of the land records. I want you to understand that. Nothing about what happens next will be fast. I understand. But it will happen. He said it with the weight of a man who has watched justice move slowly enough to know that slow is different from absent. It will happen. He went upstairs. Outside, Red Hollow was finally quiet in the way of a town that has actually done something, rather than just watched something happen. The street was empty now, the afternoon's gathering dispersed to houses and supper tables, and the specific kind of conversation that follows a day when everything changes. There would be versions of this told and retold, things emphasized and things omitted, the way history always got made at the local level, imperfectly and selectively. But the shape of it would persist. Rhett held the hotel door open, and they stepped out onto the porch. The night was clear and the stars were out, the territory dark beyond the edge of town in every direction, the great openness that surrounded Red Hollow and made all human argument seem both urgent and small simultaneously. Your father's claim, Alara said. Hollis said the land records. I know. He was looking at the street. I'm not thinking about that tonight. She looked at him. What are you thinking about? He was quiet for a moment. I'm thinking the boy rode well. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way it arrived without warning from somewhere she hadn't expected anything to arrive from tonight. He did, she said. He rode very well. They stood there on the porch while the night settled in around them, and below on the quiet street of Red Hollow, the last lamp in the land office went dark, and somewhere down toward the livery, Callum's horses stood in unfamiliar stalls. And in the hotel behind them, the evidence of 8 years waited to be carried to a court that would take its time and do its work, and none of this was finished, and all of it had changed. The weeks after Callum's arrest had a quality Alara hadn't anticipated. Not relief exactly, but a kind of suspended uncertainty, the feeling of a room after furniture has been removed, the space where something heavy used to be now just open air that you keep almost tripping into. Red Hollow didn't transform overnight. She would have distrusted it if it had. What happened instead was slower and more honest. People went back to their lives and their routines and their small daily negotiations with survival, except that the architecture underneath all of it had shifted in ways that would take months to fully understand. Callum's company store in Black Ridge closed within a week. No one to operate it, the manager having apparently decided that distance from the situation was its own form of wisdom. The mining operation itself was frozen under Hollis's injunction, the shafts going quiet, the processing facility shuttered. 23 men who had been working those claims under the debt structure Webb's records described were suddenly free of obligations that the injunction rendered legally void. Some of them came through Red Hollow on their way elsewhere. A few stayed. Harlan Webb did not keep his job at the land office. He hadn't expected to. He'd submitted his resignation the morning after Hollis's arrival, written in his precise accountant's hand on land office letterhead, and Hollis had accepted it without ceremony and appointed a temporary administrator from the county seat while a permanent replacement was found. Webb had gone home to his wife and daughter, and whatever interior reckoning waited for him there, and Alara found she had no particular feelings about his fate. Not forgiveness, not satisfaction, just the flat acknowledgement that he was a man who would spend the rest of his life with the knowledge of what he'd done and what it had taken to stop doing it. That was its own consequence. The court would add to it in time. Drummond was a more complicated matter. He had discharged his weapon in defense of a civilian. He had provided a full statement to Hollis. He had, in the moment when the situation required him to choose, chosen a different side than the one he'd been standing on for 11 years. None of this erased the 11 years. Hollis had made that clear in the precise, unsentimental way Hollis made most things clear. Drummond's cooperation was noted and would be considered, and Drummond would still face a board of inquiry regarding his conduct during his tenure, and the outcome of that inquiry was not something anyone could predict. Drummond had accepted this with the bearing of a man who has stopped arguing with consequences. He continued to serve as sheriff in the interim. There was no one else, and the town needed order more than it needed symbolic gesture, and he did so with the particular gravity of a man who no longer takes the badge for granted. Ben Colby, his young deputy, turned out to be competent in ways that hadn't been visible when his job was primarily to stand behind Drummond and look official. With something real to do, he did it. People noticed. The court proceedings began 6 weeks after Callum's transport to the county seat. Alara attended the first 3 days of hearings, riding to the county seat with Rhett and Nora Watts and Doc Emery, who had assembled his records into a formal presentation that took 4 hours to deliver and which the presiding judge listened to with the focused attention of someone encountering something both precise and damning. The letters were entered into evidence on the second day. Alara sat in the gallery and watched Amos Dale's words read aloud in a courtroom. The specific phrasing, the careful documentation of what Callum had said in a meeting 7 years ago, and felt something she couldn't entirely name. Not closure. Closure was a word invented by people who hadn't lived inside something long enough to understand that the end of a thing and the healing of it were separated by a long stretch of ordinary time. But it was something. The words existed in the record now. They had weight that was recognized by an institution. Callum's lawyer was good, expensive from the East, the kind of legal representation that money could produce even in diminished circumstances. He challenged the provenance of the letters, questioned the chain of custody, cross-examined Emery at length on the diagnostic basis for his conclusions. He was doing his job and doing it well, and Alara watched him do it without resentment because the process was the point. The process existing at all was the point. 8 years ago, there had been no process available to her father or to Amos Dale, and the absence of it had cost them everything. The process being slow and contested and imperfect was still infinitely preferable to its absence. On the third day, one of Callum's own men, Briggs, the one who'd drawn his gun on the street, submitted a statement through his own lawyer in exchange for reduced charges. The statement corroborated Dale's letters in specific detail. It named names beyond Callum, extending the picture into county structures that hadn't been part of the original case. Hollis had told her it would take time. He had not been understating it. She rode back to Red Hollow after the third day with the understanding that justice was a project, not an event, and that her participation in it was going to be measured in years rather than mornings. She found this less discouraging than she would have expected. She had, it turned out, a considerable capacity for the long game. Her father had given her that, among other things. The question of her father's claim came back through the courts 4 months later. Hollis had flagged it in his initial filing. The Quinn mineral rights, Callum's acquisition of them, the documentary basis for that acquisition now being thrown into significant doubt by everything Webb's records and Dale's letters revealed. The review took time because everything took time, but when it came back, the finding was unambiguous. The original transfer had been executed under conditions that constituted coercion, and the rights reverted to the estate of Thomas Quinn. Alara was in Red Hollow when she received the letter. She read it twice at the kitchen table of the boarding house. Nora had given her a room months ago, and the room had become something more than temporary by the ordinary accumulation of days. And then she put the letter down and sat with it for a while. The mineral rights were worth something, not a fortune. The silver seam in Blackridge was productive but not spectacular. and the costs of working a claim were considerable, but something. Enough to matter, enough to change the range of what was possible. She thought about her father reading these same words. She thought about how he would have felt, sitting at a kitchen table somewhere with a letter in his hands, the thing he'd spent years trying to establish, finally established. She thought about what he'd wanted, not the mineral rights specifically, but what they represented, the land he'd believed in, the future he'd been building toward, the stubborn conviction that the territory would open up for a man willing to be patient. He had been right about the territory. He had been wrong about what patience would cost. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the same place she'd kept the letters from Dale. Then she went to find Rhett. He was at the livery, which was where he tended to be when he had something to think through, not working, exactly, but present with the horses in the way of someone who finds thinking easier when his hands have something to do. He was running a brush along the neck of his bay with the unhurried motion of a man who has nowhere to be and is at peace with that, which was a quality she'd come to recognize as one of the genuine things about him, rather than a performance of ease. She stood in the livery door and told him about the letter. He listened without interrupting, which was also a genuine thing about him. Then he set the brush on the rail and looked at her with the careful attention he brought to the things that mattered. "What do you want to do with it?" he said. "I don't know yet." She leaned against the doorframe. "I've been trying to figure out what my father would have wanted, and then I realized that's the wrong question." "What's the right question?" "What I want." She looked at the light coming through the livery doors, the afternoon gold of it on the hay and the dust. He built something here. He believed in this place before it gave him any reason to. I understand that. I don't think I understood it when he was alive, but I understand it now. She paused. I want to do something with this land that he'd recognize, not as a monument to him, just something that continues the part of what he was doing that was worth continuing. Rhett looked at her for a moment. "The Blackridge men," he said, "the ones who came through. Some of them are looking for land." "I know. And there are families coming through on the eastern route who are looking for, not mining claims, agricultural land, good water access." "The Quinn land has 3 creek crossings," she said. "My father mapped them all." He nodded slowly. "And there's the question of housing," she said. "Men who were living in the company dormitories at the Blackridge operation don't have. There's a housing deficit in the territory right now with the operation frozen. If someone built Alara," he said it gently, not stopping her, just placing his hand on the speed of her thinking. She stopped. "One thing at a time," he said. "I know." She looked at her boots. I can see it. I can see what it could be." "I know you can." He picked the brush back up and turned back to his horse, and there was something in the gesture that was comfortable in a way that took her a moment to identify. The ease of 2 people occupying a space without needing to fill it with performance. "Tell me what you see." So she told him. Standing in the livery door in the afternoon light, she described what she could see when she thought about the Quinn land and the people passing through Red Hollow and the gap between what the territory had been under Callum's vision of it and what it might be under a different one. She talked until the light shifted and the temperature dropped the way it did in early evening, and Rhett listened and asked questions, practical questions, specific questions, the questions of a man who is not just being kind, but is genuinely trying to understand the shape of something. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your father was trying to build something," he said, "and Callum was trying to extract something. Those aren't just different strategies, they're different beliefs about what land is for." "Yes," she said. "Exactly. And you're your father's daughter." She thought about that, about what it meant to be her father's daughter, the good parts of it, the stubbornness and the vision, and the refusal to let go of a thing he believed in, without being bound to repeat his mistakes, his silence, his fatal patience with forces that had not deserved his patience. "I'm my own thing," she said. "But yes, also that." The ranch lands opened in the spring. It was not, in the end, a grand gesture or a formal declaration. Alara had specifically avoided anything that looked like ceremony, partly because ceremony seemed dishonest to the difficulty of what had actually happened, and partly because the people she was trying to reach were not people drawn to ceremony. They were people who had been through hard things and were looking for something practical and solid and real. She worked with a land surveyor from the county seat, a careful woman named Deirdre Price, who had a gift for reading terrain and translating it into something useful, to divide the Quinn land into parcels that could be settled or farmed or worked in ways that didn't depend on a single centralized operation controlling all of it. The creek crossings were mapped and protected as shared access. The parcels were sized for families rather than speculation, small enough to be worked, large enough to matter. The first families arrived in April. A couple from the east with 3 children who looked at the land with the expression of people who had been told something was possible and are now confronted with the physical fact of it. A man from the Blackridge operation who had spent 4 years in debt to a company store and who stood on his parcel and said nothing for a long time, and then said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This is mine." 2 sisters traveling together who wanted to farm and had been told in several territories that women couldn't hold a claim, and who Alara directed to Deirdre Price and the county land office and the very clear language of the new assessment structure Hollis had overseen. "You'll have a fight for it," Alara told them honestly. "We know how to fight," the older one said.
"I know you do," Alara said, "but now you have the paperwork." More people came through the summer, not a flood. The territory didn't work that way, and she'd been suspicious of anyone who promised her floods. A steady accumulation of individuals and families making individual decisions about individual futures, which was how places actually got built. Red Hollow itself changed in the incremental way of things that are changing before anyone notices. The land office under its new administrator processed claims without the systematic distortion that Webb had maintained for 8 years, which meant that the assessments meant what they were supposed to mean, and people who'd been locked out of legitimate ownership by manipulated numbers found the doors unexpectedly open. Emery hired an assistant, a young man who'd come through from the east and had some medical training, which meant that the work of keeping people alive was not entirely dependent on one aging doctor with unsteady hands and 20 years of accumulated guilt that he was slowly and without dramatic declaration working through. Nora Watts expanded the boarding house. She did not consult anyone about this. She simply, one morning, began making arrangements, and by autumn, there were 3 new rooms and a common dining table that accommodated 12 people, and which was, most evenings, full. Hector Birch cut Alara's hair one afternoon in late summer without charging her, which was the closest he ever came to saying what he needed to say, and which she accepted in the spirit it was offered.
Rhett's father's claim was formally restored in August. He told her about it the evening the letter arrived, in the same livery which had become a kind of unofficial meeting point between them, the place they talked when the talking was real. He held the letter the way she'd held hers, with the particular careful neutrality of someone managing a feeling too large and too old to fit neatly into an expression. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Strange." He folded the letter. "I've been working toward this for 4 years. I thought when it came I'd feel, I don't know, more certain about what it meant." "What does it mean?" He thought about it honestly, which was what she'd come to expect from him. "My father came to this territory with something in him, some belief, that a man could make something real here if he worked at it. And Callum took that. Not just the claim, the thing underneath it." He looked at the letter. "Getting the claim back is something, but you can't give a man back the belief Callum took from him. That's already gone." She understood what he meant. She'd been thinking something similar about her father for months. The letters restored, the claim restored, the injustice named and addressed, and still the man was dead at 52, with his plans incomplete and his drafts unsent. "No," she said, "you can't give it back. But you can do something with what's left." He looked up at her. "The land. I was thinking about what you said, about what your father wanted versus what you want. And I think I've been trying to recover something that's already gone. The exact thing my father had, in the exact form he had it." He paused. "It doesn't work that way." "No," she said, "it doesn't. But something else might." She looked at him. This man who had ridden into her life on a dark bay horse on a road north of Red Hollow, this man who was not simple and was not easy, and who carried his own history the way everyone carried their history, imperfectly and with occasional pain. She had not fallen in love with him the way stories described falling in love. Not suddenly, not in a rush of declared feeling. It had been slower than that, built from the specific materials of shared work and demonstrated trust, and the particular intimacy of people who have been through something hard together and come out the other side still choosing to occupy the same space. She didn't say any of that. She said, "What did you have in mind?" And he told her. The thing they built together in the years that followed was not a monument and was not a legend and was not the subject of any formal record. It was a working operation, land managed with a respect for what it could sustain, parcels distributed to people who could use them, water access maintained as common ground, a small structure at the creek crossing that served as a kind of informal way station for people coming through who needed somewhere to stop. People came through who were running from something. People came through who were looking for something. The territory didn't sort them cleanly. Most people were doing both simultaneously, and the distinction mattered less than what they did when they arrived. Some of them had been sold. Not always in the literal way Alara had been sold, though that happened too in this territory, in forms that shifted with the law and the enforcers of it, but in the broader sense of having been given no choice, having found themselves in arrangements they hadn't consented to and couldn't easily exit. To those people, Alara offered what she'd needed and hadn't had: a place to stop, information about their legal standing, a contact at the county seat who wasn't Callum's man, and the practical reality of another option. She was not always kind about it. Kindness in the abstract was a luxury. What she offered was specific and concrete and didn't require the recipient to perform gratitude. Rhett handled the things that required his particular skill set. Not violence, rarely violence, but the quality of his presence. The reputation that had preceded him into every room for a decade, and which he'd stopped trying to outrun and started, carefully, trying to point in useful directions. Men who might have pushed, who might have tested the edges of what was acceptable in this particular piece of the territory, tended to look at him and revise their assessment of what was worth trying. It was not a comfortable thing to be, necessarily. He carried it without complaint and without pretense. Ben Colby became sheriff the following year after Drummond's board of inquiry concluded and Drummond retired to a house at the eastern edge of town, where he kept a small garden that he tended with the attention of a man who has decided that small things done carefully are the appropriate scale for the rest of his life. Colby was not a perfect sheriff. He was young and occasionally overconfident and had a temper he was still learning to manage. But he was honest in a structural way, honest in the way his choices were made, and that was the thing that mattered most. Callum was convicted on 11 counts. The sentence was long enough that he would be old when it ended, and the confiscation of assets associated with the operation was extensive. The money that flowed back through the court process to the men who had worked the Blackridge claims under fraudulent debt structures was not what those years were worth. Nothing was what those years were worth. But it was something, and something was what the law could do, and Alara had stopped expecting the law to be capable of more than that. She had, over the course of this, stopped being angry in the consuming way she'd been angry for 3 years. The anger hadn't disappeared. It had transformed into something more sustainable, a kind of clarity about what was wrong with the world and what could be done about it and what couldn't. The things that couldn't be undone were still there. Her father was still dead. Amos Dale was still dead. The years those men at the Blackridge mines had spent in debt to a system designed to keep them in debt were still gone. You couldn't give those things back. You could only decide what you did with the time that remained. On the second anniversary of the morning on the main street, a morning in late summer, the sky, the clear specific blue that the territory produced in late summer, Alara sat on the porch of the building they'd put up at the creek crossing and watched a family come over the rise. A man and a woman and 2 small children, a wagon loaded with the specific combination of practical goods and personal possessions that people brought when they were starting over. They came down the slope with the deliberate pace of people who have been traveling for a long time and are beginning to let themselves believe they might be close to stopping. They pulled up at the creek crossing, and the man climbed down and let the horses drink and looked around at the land. He saw Alara on the porch. He raised his hand in the cautious greeting of a traveler who doesn't know what he's arrived at. She raised hers back. "This the Quinn station?" he called. "It is. We were told there might be... We heard there was land available for settling. Reasonable terms. There is, she said. Come up and I'll tell you about it. They came up. All four of them. The children jumping down from the wagon with the irrepressible energy of small people who have been sitting still too long. The woman looked at Alara with the expression of someone trying to read whether they were welcome, the specific vulnerability of a person who has needed things from strangers before and doesn't always take it well. Alara knew that expression. She had worn it herself. Sit down, she said. I'll get water, then we'll talk. She went inside and got the water and came back out, and they sat together in the afternoon sun, and she told them what was available and what it would require and what they could expect and what they couldn't. She was honest about the hard parts. There were always hard parts. The land was good, but it required work, and the winters were serious, and the community that was building here was real but imperfect, assembled from people with histories and habits that didn't always fit together cleanly. But it's yours, she said. Whatever you put into it is yours. Nobody is going to come and tell you the debt was structured differently than you understood, or that the claim was always someone else's, or that the arrangement wasn't what you agreed to. She said it simply, without drama, because it was simply true, and because simple truths didn't need dramatic delivery. They needed only to be said and then followed. The man looked at his wife. She looked back at him with an expression that was not certainty. Certainty was expensive, and they'd apparently spent theirs getting here, but something adjacent to it, something that said, this is the thing we came for, or close enough to it to try. All right, he said. Alara looked at the land beyond the porch. The creek line, the rise of the hill, the afternoon light on the grass that was greener here near the water than anywhere else. The territory opening up in every direction toward its own particular version of possible. She thought about her father coming to Red Hollow 20 years ago with a small amount of savings and a gift for reading land. She thought about what he had believed and what it had cost him and what he had left behind, tucked in the lining of an old trunk, waiting. She thought about what she now understood that she hadn't known then. That the people who believe in a place before it gives them any reason to are not naive. They are doing something difficult and necessary. They are choosing to act as if the future is worth building before the future has proven it deserves the effort. And sometimes they don't live to see it. And sometimes what they leave behind is enough for someone else to carry forward, imperfectly, in the shape of their own life rather than the shape the original dreamer intended. That was not a tragedy. That was just how it worked. The children had found the creek and were engaged in the universal project of small people near water, which was to get as wet as possible as quickly as possible. Their mother called out to them without real urgency, and they ignored her in the way of children who understand instinctively which corrections are optional. Rhett came around the side of the building and stopped when he saw the family. He looked at Alara. She tilted her head toward the man on the porch step. Rhett sat down on the rail and listened while the man explained what they were looking for, and then he and Alara talked to this family the way they talked to everyone who came over the rise. Directly, honestly, without promise of anything beyond what was real, which was enough. It was enough. That was the thing she had learned, the thing she would have told her younger self if younger selves could hear anything. Enough was not a small word. Enough was what you built toward, and what you recognized when you arrived, and what you protected with everything you had. It didn't look like the dreams you started with. It looked like what you made with what remained after the dreams met the actual world, and both of them got reshaped in the collision. It looked like this afternoon, this porch, this light, these children in this creek, this man beside her, who had ridden down a road looking for the same thing she was looking for before either of them knew the other existed. It looked like Red Hollow on a clear summer day, not healed. Places didn't heal exactly, the same way people didn't heal exactly. But they changed, they grew over the wound in the way of living things, putting new growth through the scar. It looked like Red Hollow continuing, and the people in it continuing, and the work of making something worth continuing going on in the ordinary daily way that work goes on. The girl they had sold like livestock had become the woman who held the deed. Not because the world had been fair to her. It hadn't. Not because justice had been swift or complete or satisfying in the clean way that stories sometimes promised. It hadn't been any of those things. But because she had taken what her father left her, and what 4 letters in a boot could do and what one stranger on a road could change, and she had refused to let any of it go to waste. That was the whole of it. That was enough.